Some stories begin with love at first sight, others with fate pulling two souls together. But Madison's story, it was nothing like that. A black Christian woman from Brooklyn Falls, in love with a cold-blooded Russian mafia, is a love story that never should have happened. It began with a voice she ignored, a voice that warned her, whispered to her heart, "Walk away." She was a woman of faith, a prayer warrior who believed in the power of God to save the hardest of souls. But could even the fiercest prayers change the heart of a man drenched in blood? Maxim Mikhailov was a name spoken in fear, a man whose past was written in violence, cold, ruthless, untouchable. He had no use for love. And yet, when their worlds collided, something shifted. Could a praying woman break through the darkness of a mafia king? Or would love cost her more than she was willing to lose? Let's step into Madison's world. Madison Carter sat on the edge of her neatly made bed, staring blankly at the framed scripture on her nightstand. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Proverbs 3:5-6. She had memorized this verse when she was 12, the same year she gave her life to Christ. From that moment, she had strived to live by it, seeking God's guidance in every area of her life. Her career, God led her to it. Her friends, God handpicked them. Where she lived, where she served in ministry, what she wore, she listened and obeyed. But there was one area where she had consistently ignored the Holy Spirit's voice: relationships. Madison exhaled sharply, gripping the gold-framed picture of the verse, as if doing so would somehow transfer its wisdom into her wavering heart. How had she ended up here? Broken, humiliated, and questioning everything she thought she knew. It had been a pattern, one she didn't want to admit was entirely her fault. Every time she met a man, she prayed, and every time, God answered. And yet she would reason her way out of obedience, convincing herself that maybe, just maybe, this time she had misheard him. She had ignored God before, and it always ended in heartbreak. But nothing compared to the devastation of her last relationship. When she met Anthony Jacobs, she was certain he was an answered prayer. He was everything a woman could want: a 6-figure salary, a sleek black Mercedes, a Staten Island house with a waterfront view, and the most charming personality she had ever encountered. He was kind, generous, protective, and above all intentional. From their very first date, he made it clear that he wasn't playing games. "I see a future with you, Madison," he had said over a candlelit dinner at an upscale Manhattan restaurant. "I'm not here to waste your time. I want something real." And that was all she had ever wanted, something real. So when God whispered to her heart, "He is not the one I have for you," she struggled. "Lord, how could this man not be from you? He's perfect." But deep down she knew, she always knew. She just didn't listen. For a year, she ignored the warning signs, the secretive phone calls, the weekend trips where he'd suddenly disappear, the way he never introduced her to his family. Every time she questioned him, he had an answer. It wasn't until a chance encounter at a grocery store in Brooklyn that the truth shattered her perfect fantasy. She'd been reaching for a carton of almond milk when a woman bumped into her. "Oh, I'm so sorry," the woman apologized, smiling warmly. She looked to be in her early 40s, stylish, with an air of confidence. "I should have been paying attention." Madison smiled. "No worries." Then she saw the 3 children standing beside the woman, 2 girls and a boy, all of whom looked unmistakably like Anthony. Madison's breath caught in her throat. And then came the final blow. The youngest girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mummy, can we call Daddy and ask if we can get ice cream?" Madison felt the blood drain from her face. No, this can't be happening. The woman followed her daughter's gaze and turned toward Madison again. "You okay?" Madison's voice failed her. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. Then she saw it. The woman's left hand, the wedding ring. Jesus, no! The woman noticed Madison's stare and chuckled. "Oh, I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself. I'm Angela Jacobs." Madison's world shattered. She never heard the rest of what Angela said. The ringing in her ears was too loud. Her heart pounded so hard it drowned out every other sound. Anthony was married. Not just married, he had 3 children. He had lied to her for an entire year. Madison sat in her apartment for 2 days, numb. She hadn't eaten, hadn't prayed, hadn't even cried. She replayed everything in her mind, the memories now tainted with betrayal. How did I let this happen? How did I not see it? And then came the crushing guilt. Lord, you warned me. You told me he wasn't the one, but I didn't listen again. The shame was unbearable. By the 3rd day, she had collapsed on her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. God, I'm so sorry, she wept. I can't do this anymore. I don't trust myself. I need you to take control because I clearly don't know what I'm doing. In that moment, an undeniable peace settled over her. And then a thought, no, a command, came into her spirit so clearly it startled her. Take the job in Russia. Madison frowned, still kneeling on the floor. What? The offer had been sitting in her email for weeks. A prestigious international school in Moscow had reached out, offering her a teaching position. She had barely considered it. She had no desire to move to Russia. But the Holy Spirit spoke again. Go. She hesitated. But why, Lord? No answer came. Just peace. And she knew this wasn't a suggestion. This was an instruction. A fresh start. A way to finally break free from her cycle of disobedience. She wiped her tears, stood up, and walked straight to her laptop. She clicked on the email and typed, Dear Director Ivanov, thank you for your patience. I would love to accept the position at your school. Please let me know the next steps for relocation. Best, Madison Carter. She hit send. And just like that, her new life began. 2 months later, Madison stepped off the plane at Sheremetyevo International Airport in Moscow, wrapped in a thick wool coat to brace against the biting cold. Snowflakes danced in the air, and the chill immediately seeped into her bones. What have I done, she thought. She had never been to Russia, never even considered visiting. And yet, here she was, starting a new life in a country where she didn't speak the language, didn't know a soul, and had no idea what awaited her. But for the first time in years, she had obeyed God without question. That had to mean something. As she walked through the terminal, dragging her suitcase behind her, she noticed a tall, broad-shouldered man standing near the exit, holding a sign with her name on it, Madison Carter. He had an air of authority, his piercing blue eyes scanning the crowd like a man who was always on guard. His black trench coat and leather gloves only added to his intimidating presence. That must be my driver, she thought, steeling herself before walking up to him. Hello, she greeted, her breath visible in the icy air. I'm Madison. The man's gaze settled on her, unreadable. Then, in a thick Russian accent, he said, I know who you are. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. She swallowed. Are you from the school? He didn't answer right away. He simply tilted his head, studying her. Then, with a small smirk, he extended his hand. I am Ivanovich. Madison hesitated before shaking his hand. His grip was firm, almost too firm. Ivanovich did not offer any further explanation, and Madison did not probe either. As they stepped outside into the Moscow winter, she had no idea what awaited her. Snowflakes drifted down in lazy spirals as Madison hurried through the streets of Moscow, her coat pulled tightly around her. She had been in Russia for a little over a week, and the culture shock was hitting her harder than she expected. Everything was different. The food, the customs, even the way people interacted. She had imagined Moscow to be a city of elegant architecture and rich history, but what she hadn't expected was how cold and distant it felt, not just in temperature but in demeanor. The people rarely smiled, eye contact was minimal, and personal space was sacred. Unlike in Brooklyn, where strangers struck up conversations on street corners, here silence ruled the streets. Why did I come here again? She thought, adjusting her gloves as she stepped onto the icy sidewalk. Oh yes, she had come to escape, to heal, to find herself again, and to obey. The Holy Spirit had led her here. That much she knew, and despite her confusion, she trusted him. She always had. Madison's job was straightforward: teach English to the niece of one of Russia's wealthiest businessmen. The girl, Alina Mikhailova, was only 10 years old, but carried herself with the poise of someone much older. She was bright, inquisitive, and, to Madison's surprise, lonely. "Do you like Moscow?" Alina asked one evening, as they sat in the study room of the sprawling mansion. Madison hesitated. "It's different." Alina smirked, flipping through her English workbook. "That means no." Madison chuckled. "I guess it takes some getting used to." The child watched her carefully. "You will get used to it, but be careful who you trust." A chill ran through Madison's spine. There was something about the way Alina said it, the way her youthful voice darkened, that made her pause. She wanted to ask more, but a knock on the door interrupted them. A sharply dressed man in a black suit entered, speaking rapidly in Russian. Alina nodded before turning to Madison. "We have a family event tonight. You must come." Madison blinked. "I wasn't aware of any—" "It's not a request," Alina said, closing her book. Madison sighed. She had no idea what she was getting herself into. The venue was a grand estate just outside Moscow. Crystal chandeliers bathed the lavish hall in golden light, and the air buzzed with quiet conversations spoken in hushed, clipped Russian. The guests, men in tailored suits, women in shimmering gowns, moved with an air of authority, their faces unreadable, their eyes cold. Madison felt out of place immediately. She stood near the entrance, scanning the room for Alina. Instead, her eyes landed on someone else. A man stood near the bar, his presence commanding even in a room full of power. He was tall, dressed in a fitted black suit that seemed tailored to perfection. His sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes were framed by short, dark hair, and there was something about him, something dangerous. The moment her gaze met his, a sharp jolt ran through her like lightning striking her soul. And then it happened. The Holy Spirit whispered, "That is the man I have prepared for you." Madison's breath caught. No. She shook her head slightly, pressing her fingers against her temple, as if she could shake the voice away. She must have misheard. This couldn't be right. But as she looked at him again, she felt it in the depths of her spirit, the certainty, the divine knowing. Horror and confusion warred inside her. God couldn't be serious. This man, whoever he was, oozed danger. Everything in his stance, in his eyes, in the way others subtly avoided his direct gaze, screamed ruthless. "God, this makes no sense," she thought, gripping her clutch tightly. As if sensing her distress, the man tilted his head slightly, his cold blue eyes narrowing as they locked onto hers. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face before he began walking toward her. Madison's pulse spiked. No, I need to get out of here." She turned sharply, moving toward the exit. But before she could escape, a strong hand wrapped around her wrist. She gasped, spinning to face the man. Up close, he was even more intimidating. His grip was firm but not painful, his expression unreadable. "You don't belong here," he said in a deep accented voice. "Neither do you," she wanted to say, but the words caught in her throat. Instead she whispered, "I know." A smirk ghosted his lips before he released her. For a moment they just stood there, eyes locked in silent battle. And then he spoke again. "I am Maxim Mikhailov." Madison swallowed. She had heard that name before, and now she wished she hadn't. Madison's world tilted. Maxim Mikhailov. The name sent chills through Madison's spine. She had heard it mentioned in hushed tones, on the news, in whispers at the mansion. He was feared, a man whose presence commanded both respect and terror. And God had told her he was the one. No, she must have misunderstood. "I need to go," she murmured, stepping back. But Maxim didn't move. He studied her as if trying to unravel a mystery. "Who are you?" Madison hesitated. "No one important." A slow smirk played at his lips. "Lies." She clenched her fists. "Believe what you want." Turning on her heel, she forced herself to walk away, ignoring the feeling of his eyes burning into her back. Madison spent the next few days trying to avoid Maxim. She buried herself in work, focusing on Alina's lessons. But then the invitation came. A man in a crisp suit arrived at the mansion, handing her a note. "Dinner, 8 p.m., wear red. Maxim." She stared at the note, her heart pounding. There was no request in those words, only a command. Madison paced her room, staring at the note on her dresser. She had two choices. Ignore it and make an enemy of a powerful man, or go and find out why God had sent her here. Taking a deep breath, she whispered a prayer. "Lord, I don't understand this, but I trust you." With trembling hands, she reached for the red dress hanging in her closet. Whatever happened next, she was stepping into it with faith. Madison stepped into the restaurant, a secluded, dimly lit space, exuding wealth and exclusivity. The air was thick with the aroma of fine wine and aged wood, the soft murmur of conversations blending with the slow melody of a violin playing in the background. Maxime was already seated at a private table near a grand fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His piercing blue eyes flickered with something unreadable as he watched her approach. "You came," he said, his voice low and smooth. Madison took a slow breath and sat across from him. "You didn't give me much of a choice." A smirk touched his lips. "You had a choice. You made the right one." The waiter appeared instantly, pouring a deep red wine into her glass. She hesitated, then declined with a small shake of her head. Maxime raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. The conversation started polite. Small talk about Moscow, her job, how she was adjusting. But it didn't take long for Maxim to steer the conversation toward her. "Who are you, Madison?" His voice held an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "You don't belong in this world, and yet here you are." She met his gaze steadily. "I could ask you the same thing." A ghost of amusement flickered across his face before he leaned back, watching her as if she were a puzzle he intended to solve. What had she just walked into? The meal arrived, steak for him, a delicate seafood dish for her. She forced herself to take a few bites, aware of Maxime's eyes on her the entire time. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Do you believe in God?" Madison nearly choked on her water. She set her glass down carefully. "Yes." His expression didn't change. "And you think he speaks to you?" She stiffened. "Yes." He studied her for a long moment before saying, "Then tell me, what did he say about me?" Madison's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She should lie, she should say nothing. But something in his gaze told her he would know if she did. So she whispered, "That you're the man he has prepared for me." The air between them went still. For the first time that evening, Maxim looked truly shaken. A slow, dark chuckle escaped Maxim's lips, but it wasn't humor, it was disbelief. "You're either insane," he murmured, swirling his whiskey, "or dangerously naive." Madison swallowed. "I didn't expect this either." He leaned forward, his voice dropping into something more menacing. "You don't know what kind of man I am, Madison." She met his gaze head-on. "I know exactly who you are." Silence stretched between them. Then, without warning, he stood, tossing a few crisp bills onto the table. "We're leaving." "Excuse me. You're in my world now, and in my world you don't walk alone at night." It wasn't a request. Madison hesitated for only a second before rising. As they stepped out into the cold Moscow night, she realized that dinner hadn't been just a meal. It had been a test, and she had passed. But at what cost? The sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Maxim opened the door for her, a gesture that felt both chivalrous and controlling. Madison slid into the passenger seat, hyper-aware of his presence beside her. The streets of Moscow blurred past as the car moved through the night. Then suddenly Maxim's phone rang. He answered in Russian. His tone was calm, but his entire body tensed. Something was wrong. Madison couldn't understand the conversation, but the sharp edge in his voice sent chills down her spine. Then, without warning, he turned the car sharply down a side street. "Maxim?" He didn't answer. The car slowed in front of a nondescript building. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You trust your God, yes?" She hesitated. "Yes." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Then pray." Before she could respond, the doors unlocked. Get inside, and do not open the door for anyone but me." A sense of dread crawled up her spine, but she obeyed. As soon as she stepped inside, the door shut behind her, leaving her alone in the darkness. Madison's breath came in short, uneven bursts. She tried to steady herself, reaching for her phone. No service. "Lord, what have you put me in the middle of?" The room was dimly lit, sparsely furnished but secure. She tried to listen, distant voices, the sound of cars passing outside, but she couldn't tell what was happening. Then she heard it. Gunshots. Her breath hitched. Everything in her screamed to run, to hide, but she forced herself to stay still. "Trust me." The voice of the Holy Spirit was quiet but firm. She closed her eyes, gripping the cross necklace around her neck. "Lord, protect him, whatever this is, whoever he is. Let your will be done." Minutes felt like hours. Then at last the door opened. Maxim stood there, his face unreadable. A streak of blood stained his sleeve. "Let's go," he said, his voice lower, more controlled. Madison swallowed hard but followed. As they drove off into the night, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer just an observer in this world. She was in it, and there was no turning back. Moscow's underworld was a beast with many heads, but Maxim Mikhailov had long tamed it. He was more than a leader. He was a legend whispered in the dark alleys, the shadow that men feared before they breathed their last. A ruthless enforcer turned king, he had built his empire on blood and discipline. Every man who had dared to stand against him had fallen, and those who remained knew better than to challenge his rule. Power was a strange thing. It gave Maxim everything, money, fear, control, but it had also stolen something from him. Perhaps it had been so long that he no longer remembered what it was. Humanity, peace, the ability to feel something other than rage. If there was one thing Maxim knew, it was that men like him did not hesitate, did not falter. And yet, with Madison Carter, hesitation gnawed at him like a slow poison. He first noticed it when she spoke to him with unshaken confidence, her voice steady, despite knowing the kind of man he was. She did not flinch under his gaze, nor did she try to impress him as most women did. Instead, she looked at him as if she saw something beyond the mask he had carefully crafted, something he had buried long ago. Maxim had faced death countless times. He had stood at the edge of the abyss and leapt without fear. But Madison unnerved him in a way no enemy ever had, because she made him question what he had always known to be true. And questioning was dangerous. Madison was unlike any woman Maxim had ever encountered, and that alone should have made him stay away. He had seen beauty before, but hers was different. Not the kind that lured men to sin, but the kind that made them believe in something greater than themselves. She was a teacher, a foreigner in Moscow, and a woman of faith, and yet despite her innocence, she was not naive. She had strength, real strength, the kind that did not come from power or violence, but from conviction. Maxim had spent his life in darkness. He did not believe in saints, and yet here she was, standing in the midst of corruption and crime, untouched by it, and it made no sense to him. He had been with many women, but he had never felt the need to protect one. Not like this, not in a way that made his chest tighten whenever he thought of her walking alone in a city filled with danger. Madison Carter was light, and he was darkness. The two were never meant to touch, and yet he found himself reaching for her, knowing it would only end in destruction. Madison had never been more confused in her life. She had always known what was right and what was wrong. The lines had always been clear, until now. She had come to Moscow on a mission, to serve, to teach, to be a light in a place where hope was scarce. She had prayed for direction, for God to use her as he saw fit. And now, here she was, drawn to a man who embodied everything she'd sworn to stand against. Maxim was dangerous, he was ruthless, he had blood on his hands. And yet she saw something in him, something buried beneath the scars and the violence, something even he refused to acknowledge. She prayed, seeking answers. "Lord, I don't understand," she whispered into the quiet of her apartment. "Why does my heart waver when I know what he is?" Why do I feel drawn to a man who walks in darkness? The silence was deafening. God had always spoken to her, had always guided her, but now he was silent. And the silence was worse than a no. It left room for doubt, for feelings she had no right to have. Moscow was not safe for a woman like Madison. She had felt eyes on her before, but she had ignored them, chalking it up to paranoia. It wasn't until the notes started appearing, slipped under her door, left on her desk at the language center, that she realized she was being watched. She had dismissed it at first, convincing herself it was nothing, but deep down, unease settled in her bones. What she didn't know was that Maxim was already aware. His men had been tracking the threats before she even knew they existed. And Maxim was not a man who let threats go unanswered. Madison was startled when Maxim showed up at her apartment unannounced. "You've been followed," he said, his voice low, controlled. Her stomach twisted. "How do you know that?" His jaw clenched. "Because I have men watching you." The realization sent a chill down her spine. "You've been spying on me." "I've been protecting you," he corrected. His blue eyes darkened, unreadable. "And I will continue to do so, whether you want me to or not." Madison knew she should feel angry, but all she felt was fear. Fear not of Maxim, but of the storm that seemed to be gathering around her, pulling her into his world. "You need to leave Russia," he said after a long pause. She shook her head. "I can't." Maxim exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "Madison, you do not understand the kind of men you are dealing with." "And you do?" she challenged. A ghost of a smirk touched his lips. "I am those men." She shivered at the truth of it. Madison never should have walked home alone that night. She had stayed late at the center, correcting papers, and by the time she stepped out onto the quiet Moscow street, the air was cold with the bite of winter. She barely had time to react when she heard footsteps behind her. Then a hand closed around her wrist. "Pretty girl," a voice murmured in Russian. "You shouldn't be out alone." Madison's breath caught. She turned, her pulse hammering, and found herself face to face with 3 men. Panic shot through her, but before she could scream, something changed. A gunshot. The man holding her staggered backward, blood blooming on his chest. Madison gasped, spinning just in time to see a figure step out from the shadows. Maxim. His eyes were ice, his expression unreadable. The gun in his hand still smoked from the shot he had just fired. The remaining men scattered, their bravado vanishing in the face of true fear. And Madison, she could only stare. Not at the gun, not at the body, but at Maxim, at the blood staining his hands, and at the realization that no matter how much she prayed, no matter how much she resisted, she could not run from this anymore. Madison felt like she had stepped into a nightmare. The metallic scent of blood filled the cold air, mixing with the sharp sting of gunpowder. The man Maxim had shot lay crumpled on the pavement, unmoving. The others had fled, their footsteps fading into the darkened alleyways. But she couldn't move. She should have screamed, should have run, should have felt horror claw at her throat. Instead, she looked at Maxim. His gun was still in his hand, his fingers curled tightly around the grip. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those cold, blue eyes, burned with something dark. He had killed for her. "Madison," he said, his voice low, almost careful. She swallowed, her pulse thundering in her ears. "You—" She couldn't finish. Maxim took a step closer, but she instinctively backed away. The distance between them stretched wider than the city itself. He was the lion, she was the lamb. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she had been saved or claimed. Maxim lowered his gun, sliding it into the holster beneath his coat. He did not flinch at the body on the ground or the blood on his hands. Death was an old companion to him. But Madison, she was different. She looked at him as though seeing him for the first time, and Maxim hated that look. It was not fear, it was something worse. Disillusionment. He clenched his jaw. "You were in danger. You killed a man," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He would have hurt you." She exhaled sharply, wrapping her arms around herself. "And what makes you any different?" Maxime stilled. The words should not have hurt, but they did. He stepped toward her, his movements slow, measured. "I will never hurt you." Madison squeezed her eyes shut. She wanted to believe him, but how could she trust a man whose hands were stained with blood? How could she trust herself for wanting to? That night, Madison sat in her apartment staring at her Bible, but the words blurred before her eyes. She had always believed in redemption, that no one was beyond God's grace, that even the darkest soul could be brought into the light. But Maxime, he was a man of violence. He was not merely lost. He had chosen this life. He was not a victim of his circumstances. He thrived in them. And yet, when he had looked at her tonight, she had seen something else, something she could not explain. She pressed her hands together, whispering a prayer, but the silence that followed was suffocating. Why wasn't God answering? Maxime stood in his penthouse, staring out at the Moscow skyline. A half-empty glass of vodka sat on the table, untouched. Tonight had been a mistake. He had let his control slip, had let his instincts take over. He should have handled it differently, should have let his men deal with the problem quietly. Instead, he had acted without thinking. Because it was Madison. Because the thought of anyone touching her had filled him with a rage so deep it had drowned out everything else. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned as his second-in-command, Dmitri, stepped inside. "You made a mess tonight," Dmitri said bluntly. Maxim didn't respond. Dmitri sighed. "That girl, she's dangerous for you." Maxime's jaw tightened. "She's none of your concern." "She should be none of yours," Dmitri countered. "But she is, isn't she?" Maxime said nothing, and that silence was answer enough. Madison woke up feeling heavy. Sleep had been impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Maxime standing over that body, saw the blood splattered across the pavement. But worse than the image itself was the way she felt, because no matter how much she tried to fight it, a part of her felt safe, and that terrified her. She went about her morning routine, coffee, devotions, preparing for work, but nothing felt normal. Her mind kept going back to the moment Maxime had stepped out of the shadows, the way he had looked at her, the way he had protected her. She needed to push these thoughts away. She needed to remind herself who she was, and more importantly, who Maxime was. When Madison arrived at the language center, there was an envelope waiting for her at the front desk. She frowned. Who left this? The receptionist shrugged. A man. Didn't say his name. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. She opened the envelope and pulled out a single piece of paper. "You're lucky he was there, but he won't always be." Her blood ran cold. Someone had been watching last night, and they weren't done. Maxime was already waiting when Madison arrived at his office. She had never been here before, never wanted to be, but after the note she had no choice. She threw the paper on his desk. "Tell me this doesn't have anything to do with you." Maxime's expression didn't change, but his fingers curled slightly. He read the note in silence. Then slowly he lifted his gaze. "Where did you find this?" "It was left for me at work." Maxime's jaw tightened. "I'll handle it." Madison shook her head. "That's not what I want." "It doesn't matter what you want," he interrupted, his voice low, edged with steel. "Someone threatened you. That means they threatened me." Madison swallowed hard. She should have known this was how he would react. Maxime did not fight battles with words. He fought them with war. And now someone had declared one. Madison studied Maxime. He had always been a mystery, but tonight there was something different about him. Something weary. "How did you become this?" she asked softly. Maxime exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You don't want to know." "Maybe I do." He hesitated. Then finally he spoke. "My father was a soldier, my mother a ghost in her own home. I learned young that power was the only thing that kept you from being swallowed alive." Madison's heart ached. He had been raised in violence, shaped by it. Could a man like him ever unlearn what the world had taught him? She wasn't sure, but she wanted to believe he could. The threats continued. They became more frequent, more brazen. Maxime had been patient, had tried to handle things quietly, but patience had its limits. And when someone tried to grab Madison outside the language center, that limit snapped. He found the men responsible. And this time he didn't just send a message. He made sure they would never touch her or anyone again. Madison saw the news the next morning. The men who had threatened her were found in an alley, dead. She didn't need to ask who was responsible. She already knew. She stood in her apartment, staring at her reflection in the mirror, and whispered the one question she had been too afraid to ask before. What if she wasn't meant to save Maxime? What if he was meant to destroy her? Madison sat in her dimly lit apartment, staring at the news article glowing on her phone screen. The bodies of the men who had attacked her lay in an alley, lifeless. The details were vague, but she knew the truth. Maxime had done this. Her stomach twisted. She had prayed for protection, for deliverance, but not like this. Her fingers hovered over her phone. Should she call him? Should she demand answers? But what answers could he possibly give? She squeezed her eyes shut. God, what do I do? The silence was suffocating. Her face told her to run, but her heart told her something far more dangerous. It told her she had already stepped too close. Maxim stood on his balcony, the Moscow skyline stretching before him, but his mind was elsewhere. On her, on the way she had looked at him last night, horror and something else, something that looked dangerously like disappointment, shadowing her features. He had never cared about such things, never cared if someone feared him, hated him. It was better that way. But with Madison, her judgment felt like a weight pressing on his chest, foreign and unbearable. Dmitri's voice cut through the silence. She will never forgive you, you know. Maxim didn't turn. I don't need her forgiveness. Then why haven't you let her go? Maxim said nothing, because he already knew the answer, and it terrified him. Madison didn't know why she had come. She told herself it was for closure, that she needed to hear it from him. But as she stepped into Maxim's penthouse, the weight of the moment settled over her. He stood by the window, his back to her, his broad shoulders tense. When he turned, there was no shock in his eyes, only something unreadable. You saw the news, he said. Her throat was tight. You killed them. His expression didn't change. Yes. She exhaled sharply, her chest tightening. Do you feel anything? Maxim studied her, then took slow steps toward her. Relief. Madison recoiled. That's not... They threatened you. His voice was low, steady. They would have hurt you, and if I had let them live, they would have tried again. That's not your choice to make, she whispered. Maxim's jaw tightened. It was my choice the moment you walked into my world. She hated the way his words made her heart twist, hated the way a part of her wanted to believe him. Maxim had never been a man of confession, but that night, as Madison looked at him with a war raging in her eyes, something inside him cracked. I was 12 when I saw my first murder, he said suddenly. Madison's breath hitched. My father made me watch, said it was a lesson, that a man is either predator or prey. His gaze darkened. I learned that lesson well. Madison stared at him, at the boy he had once been, trapped in a life that had never given him a choice. You don't have to be this, she whispered. Maxim's lips curled into something almost sad. Don't I? She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that God could redeem anyone. But for the first time, she wasn't sure Maxim wanted redemption. And if he didn't, how could she save a man who refused to be saved? Madison stood in her small Moscow apartment, her suitcase open on the bed as she folded clothes with shaking hands. Every movement felt mechanical, as if she were watching herself from a distance, detached from reality. The weight of her decision pressed on her, yet she forced herself to move forward. She had made up her mind. She was leaving Russia. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone and opened her flight confirmation email for the 100th time that morning. The ticket was booked, her departure set for the next day. A one-way flight to New York. No return, no second thoughts. But why did it feel like she was running away from more than just Moscow? She exhaled deeply, staring at the small cross pendant around her neck. Had she misunderstood God's leading? When she arrived in Moscow, she had been convinced it was part of her mission, a divine assignment. But now everything felt like a mistake, a tangled mess that she had no business being in. Maxim Mikhailov was dangerous, unpredictable, and undeniably captivating in ways that made her uneasy. He wasn't just a man she had met. He had somehow become woven into her thoughts, into her prayers, that terrified her more than anything else. With a determined shake of her head, she zipped up her suitcase and whispered to herself, "This is the right thing to do." Madison moved to the window, looking out over the snow-dusted rooftops of Moscow. The city stretched before her, cold and unfamiliar, yet something inside her ached at the thought of leaving. Had she really heard God wrong? She had always been confident in her faith, in the clarity of his voice. She had followed him without question, leaving behind comfort and certainty for a life of obedience. But now, doubt gnawed at the edges of her conviction. She sat down on the edge of her bed and pulled her Bible into her lap, flipping through the pages as if searching for a hidden message. Her eyes landed on Isaiah 55:8-9. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." A lump formed in her throat. Was she being impatient? Was this flight her way of taking control instead of trusting God? She closed her Bible and shook her head firmly. No, she wasn't running from God. She was running from temptation, from danger, from Maxim. And wasn't that the right thing to do? That night, sleep refused to come easily. When it finally did, it wasn't peaceful. It was vivid, unsettling. She found herself standing on the deck of an ancient wooden ship, the air thick with the scent of salt and approaching rain. The sea roiled beneath her, waves crashing violently against the hull. The wind howled, and sailors ran frantically, shouting in a language she didn't understand. And then she saw him, Jonah. His face was etched with fear, his hands trembling as he backed away from the furious sailors who surrounded him. "Throw me overboard!" he shouted, his voice swallowed by the wind. Madison tried to move forward to stop them, but she was frozen in place. She could only watch as they seized him and hurled him into the raging sea. Instantly the storm stilled. Her breath caught as the water darkened beneath the surface. Then a monstrous shape emerged, a massive fish, its mouth yawning wide. Jonah disappeared inside. Everything went black. A voice deep and unmistakable echoed through the darkness. "You cannot run from what I have called you to do." Madison gasped awake, her body drenched in sweat, her pulse racing like a war drum. She sat up, gripping the sheets. The dream had been too real, too clear. It wasn't just a dream, it was a warning, a divine warning. By morning, Madison had convinced herself that the vision had been nothing more than her subconscious playing tricks on her. It was a coincidence, a metaphor. She was nothing like Jonah. She tightened her grip on the handle of her suitcase and stepped into the waiting taxi. The driver, an older man with tired eyes, didn't speak much as they pulled onto the road. Madison sat in the back, staring out the window, trying to shake the lingering unease from her dream. She was doing the right thing. She had to believe that. She was halfway to the airport when the car jerked to a sudden stop. Before she could react, 4 men with masks swarmed the vehicle, yanking open the doors. Madison screamed as rough hands grabbed her, dragging her out into the cold street. Everything happened in a blur. She was thrown into the back of a black van, the scent of sweat and gunpowder filling the air. A sack was pulled over her head, blinding her. Her heart pounded as the van sped away. This wasn't a robbery, this wasn't random. They had come for her. She fought against the terror clawing at her chest. She had been in dangerous situations before, but never like this. "Jesus, help me," she whispered. The men didn't respond. Across the city, Maxim Mikhailov stood motionless as the news reached him. His fingers clenched around a glass of vodka, shattering it in his grip. His men shifted nervously, awaiting his reaction. Maxim had always been ruthless, calculated, but when it came to Madison, something was different, something uncontrollable. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice low, cold. No one dared to breathe. She was taken by Kirov's men, Dmitri finally said. It's a message. A dark, dangerous smile played at Maxim's lips. Then let's send them one back. Madison barely had time to process what was happening when gunfire exploded outside the warehouse where she was being held. Screams. A door burst open. And there he was, Maxim. He moved through the chaos like a force of nature, his gun steady, his face unreadable. Bodies dropped around him, but his eyes remained locked on her. In a matter of minutes, it was over. Madison couldn't move. Maxim holstered his gun and strode toward her, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he scooped her up and carried her out. The ride back to his mansion was silent. Madison stared at her lap, her heart still hammering. She had tried to run, but she had been dragged right back into Maxim's world. Back at the mansion, Maxim finally turned to her. His gaze was fierce, his jaw tight. You were leaving. It wasn't a question. Madison swallowed hard. Yes. A slow, knowing smile crossed his lips. You belong here. She should have argued. Should have told him she belonged anywhere but here. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, in the depths of her soul, she wasn't sure he was wrong. The silence between them was unbearable. Madison sat on the plush leather couch in Maxim's penthouse, staring at the marble floor as the weight of the last few hours settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She had been kidnapped, rescued, and now she was here, in his world, with no escape. Maxim stood near the window, his broad shoulders tense, his hands shoved into his pockets as he gazed out over Moscow's glittering skyline. The storm brewing inside him was almost tangible, thickening the air between them. Madison didn't know what to say. Thank you for saving me. I still want to leave. Why do you make my heart feel like it's about to explode? None of those seemed appropriate. Finally, she whispered, what now? Maxim turned, his icy blue eyes locking onto hers. Now, you stay. His voice was final, leaving no room for argument. But Madison wasn't ready to surrender so easily. She shot up from the couch, her heart slamming against her ribs. I can't stay here, Maxim. This isn't my life. This isn't... He was in front of her, in a flash, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His presence was overwhelming, intoxicating, and she hated that part of her wanted to fall into it. You don't get to decide that anymore, he said, his voice dark, with something she couldn't quite decipher. They took you because of me. That means you're mine to protect now. Madison's breath hitched. I'm not yours. A muscle in Maxim's jaw ticked, but instead of arguing, he reached out, his fingers brushing against the side of her face, so lightly, so carefully, as if she was something fragile. The moment burned into her skin. Then he stepped back, his voice quieter. You don't belong anywhere else anymore. And that terrified her more than anything. Madison couldn't sleep. She lay awake in the massive guest room Maxim had led her to, staring at the ceiling, every nerve in her body on edge. She hated him. She didn't hate him. She hated how safe she had felt in his arms when he carried her out of that warehouse. Hated how, for one fleeting second, she had wanted to bury her face against his neck and let go. No, she wouldn't be like those women who fell for men like him, men who were dangerous, men who swallowed good intentions whole. She had to leave, and yet... Her eyes burned as she turned onto her side, fighting against the war raging inside her. Some wars couldn't be won. Maxim sat in his office, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him, his fingers pressed against his temples. He had been reckless tonight. He had slaughtered men for her. That should have terrified him, it didn't. What terrified him was the way her voice had shaken when she told him she didn't belong here. The way her eyes, those defiant, heartbreaking eyes, had filled with something he couldn't bear to see. Fear of him. He had never cared what people thought of him before, but Madison wasn't people. She was something else entirely. And that was a problem. A thunderclap shattered the silence. Madison jolted upright, her breath uneven. The storm outside raged against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the wind howling through the city like a wounded animal. A knock came at the door. She froze. Madison! Maxime's voice was quiet, but it held command. For a second, she considered ignoring him, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside her. She pulled the door open. Maxime stood there, his hair disheveled, his eyes dark, his white dress shirt slightly unbuttoned, as if he had been running his hands through it in frustration. Neither of them spoke. The tension between them was unbearable. Then he exhaled sharply and shook his head. "Come with me." She followed him to the living room, the fire crackling in the massive fireplace. The storm outside had turned the world into shadows and lightning flashes, but inside, it was just them. "I don't know how to do this," Maxime admitted suddenly. Madison turned to him, confused. "Do what?" His jaw clenched. "Care about someone like you." The words stole the air from her lungs. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. Maxime stepped closer, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I should let you go. I should put you on a plane and forget you exist." Her heart pounded. "Then why don't you?" she whispered. A dark chuckle escaped him. "Because I can't." Madison felt it before it happened. The moment his restraint snapped, the air between them crackled as he reached for her, hesitant at first, as if giving her a chance to run. She didn't. His fingers brushed her jaw, tilting her face upward, his breath fanning across her lips. Every muscle in his body was tensed, as if this was the greatest battle he had ever fought. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. She should. She didn't. And then his lips crashed against hers. The world disappeared. The only thing that existed was his mouth on hers. The desperation, the fire, the unspoken battle that had been simmering between them from the start. His hands slid into her hair, gripping, as if afraid she would slip away. Madison gasped against him, and that sound, that small broken sound, made something in Maxime snap. The kiss deepened. For one terrifying, breathtaking moment, there was no war, no fear, no consequences. Just them. They broke apart, breathing heavily. Madison's fingers were still tangled in his shirt, her lips swollen, her heart slamming against her ribs. Maxime stared at her, his eyes a storm of emotion. "This was a mistake," she whispered. His hand cupped the side of her face, his thumb tracing her cheek. Was it? She wanted to say yes, but she couldn't. Maxime let out a harsh breath and stepped back, his hands raking through his hair. "I can't give you what you deserve," he admitted, his voice raw. Madison's throat tightened. "And what is that?" His eyes darkened. "A man who isn't a monster." Her heart broke for him. For the boy, he must have been before the world turned him into this. Madison swallowed hard, turning away. "I need to leave." Maxime laughed bitterly. "You say that, yet you're still here." She squeezed her eyes shut. "Because I don't know how to walk away from you." The silence stretched between them. Finally, Maxime sighed. "Then we're both doomed." She walked toward the door, stopping with her hand on the frame. Slowly she turned back. Maxime stood there, his expression unreadable, his knuckles white at his sides. And in that moment, Madison realized leaving wouldn't be as simple as she thought. Because part of her had already fallen for the one man she could never have. And he had fallen for her too. Madison sat on the edge of the grand bed in Maxime's penthouse, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she struggled against the undeniable truth clawing at her soul. She was falling for him. How could she feel anything for a man like Maxime? A man whose hands were stained with blood. A man who had lived his life wielding power, enforcing fear. A man who had taken lives without hesitation. Yet something in his eyes, those cold, calculating blue eyes, whispered that he wasn't beyond redemption. Tears welled up as she whispered, "God, if you can reach a man like him, show me how. Give me wisdom, protect me, and Lord, keep me from loving him." But deep inside, she knew it was already too late. Maxime leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a slow-burning frustration simmering in his chest. She was doing it again, talking to God like he could actually hear her. His world was built on power, not faith, on violence, not prayers. And yet watching her whisper to the ceiling, eyes filled with something he couldn't name, left him unsettled. She wasn't afraid of him. That both infuriated and intrigued him. "What are you doing?" he finally asked. Madison turned, startled but composed. "Praying for you." A cold laugh escaped him. "Waste of time." Her gaze didn't waver. "We'll see." For the first time in years, Maxime had no comeback. Madison couldn't sleep. She needed to understand who Maxime truly was. Slipping into the dimly lit library, she scanned the shelves until she found a weathered leather journal. His name was etched on the spine. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The first entry was written in bold, rough strokes. "First kill age 10. Madison's breath hitched. Page after page unfolded a story of brutality. A boy raised in darkness, stripped of innocence, taught to kill before he even understood what life was worth. Tears slid down her cheeks. No wonder he trusted no one. No wonder he believed in nothing. But she refused to believe he was beyond saving. The next morning, Maxime noticed the journal slightly out of place. His blood went cold. Every muscle in his body tensed as he reached for it, flipping through the pages, his worst fear confirmed. Someone had touched it, read it, exposed the ghosts he had buried deep. His pulse roared in his ears as he stormed into Madison's room, the book clenched in his fist. He didn't bother knocking. "You read it?" His voice was low, dangerous. Madison sat up in bed, her face calm. She didn't flinch. "Yes." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Then you know who I am." She nodded, her gaze steady. "I know who you were." The distinction rattled him. People only ever saw the monster, the king of a criminal empire, the man with blood on his hands. But she was looking at him as if there was more, and that terrified him. The days passed in tense silence. Maxime avoided Madison, keeping to his own space, yet his eyes followed her everywhere. He expected her to be afraid of him now, to shrink away, to beg for her freedom. But she didn't. She still prayed, her lips moving in whispered conversations with a god Maxime didn't believe in. She still hummed softly in the evenings, filling the penthouse with a peace he had never known. She was unlike any woman he had ever met. No fear in her eyes, no greed, no hunger for power or manipulation, just peace. It drew him in like a man dying of thirst in the desert. The scent of warm bread and roasted chicken filled the penthouse, weaving through the air like a memory Maxim couldn't place. He lingered in the doorway, watching as Madison set the table. She moved with an effortless grace, her fingers delicate as she poured tea, her face peaceful. He frowned. "You're cooking now." Madison glanced up, amused. "Would you rather starve?" Maxime huffed, but said nothing. He had eaten gourmet meals prepared by the finest chefs, but this was something different, something human. He hesitated as she pulled out a chair for him. "I don't—" He faltered, uncomfortable. Madison smiled gently. "Just sit. You don't have to say anything." He sat, and for the first time in years, Maxime ate a meal where no one expected anything from him. It felt strange. That night, Maxime lay in bed staring at the ceiling. His body was exhausted, but his mind refused to rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, praying, cooking, smiling at him like he wasn't a monster. Why? Why did she do this? Why didn't she hate him like everyone else? Frustration burned in his chest. With a growl, he reached for the gun on his nightstand, gripping it tightly. It had always been his comfort, his power, his shield. But tonight, it felt different. For the first time, it didn't bring him peace. Madison knelt beside her bed, eyes closed in prayer. Then suddenly, the world around her shifted. She wasn't in the penthouse anymore. A vision unfolded before her, a storm raging, thunder cracking through the heavens. And in the center of it all stood Maxime. Chains wrapped around him, heavy, suffocating. Shadows pulled at him, dragging him deeper into the darkness. But then a hand, reaching for him through the storm. Madison's heart pounded. God was reaching for Maxime, but would Maxime take his hand? The next night, Maxime walked past Madison's door, heading to his study. Then he felt it, something unseen but undeniable. The air shifted thick and weightless all at once. A strange, almost electric energy filled the hallway. His chest tightened. Inside the room, Madison's voice was soft but unwavering as she prayed. Maxime's fists clenched. What was this? Why did it feel like something was pulling at him, dragging him towards something he didn't understand? And why was he so afraid to let it? The next morning, Madison stepped into the kitchen and met his gaze. "You felt it, didn't you?" Maxime's face darkened. Felt what? She took a step closer, her expression calm but unwavering. "God," he scoffed, shoving his hands in his pockets. "God doesn't exist." Madison smiled, something dangerous flickering in her eyes. "Hope. Then why are you fighting so hard against him?" Maxime's phone buzzed. He barely glanced at it, expecting another routine message. But the moment he saw the sender's name, his body tensed. It was from Viktor Barinov, his rival, his enemy. His stomach twisted as he read the words. War is coming, and now she's a target, too. For a second, the world seemed to go silent. Madison. His breath left him in a slow, controlled exhale, but his pulse pounded violently against his ribs. This wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Victor never gave warnings, which meant things were worse than he thought. He tightened his grip on the phone until his knuckles turned white. Madison had nothing to do with this life. She didn't belong in his world, and yet because of him, she had become a target. There was only one way to stop it. But would she listen? Would he? Maxime stormed into Madison's room, his presence like an approaching storm. His shoulders were tense, his jaw locked. She was sitting by the window, lost in a book, but the moment she saw his face, she closed it. "You need to leave." His voice was firm, final. Madison frowned, standing. "What?" "They know about you." He ran a hand over his face, his usual composure slipping. "If you stay here, you'll die." She didn't flinch, didn't panic. She just tilted her head slightly, studying him like she was looking past the man and into his soul. "Then I'll stay." His temper snapped. "Do you not understand?" He stepped forward, his presence overwhelming, his voice sharp as a blade. "You are not safe." Her eyes softened, not in fear, but in something else, something that made him want to look away. "Neither are you." That did something to him. His breath caught, his fists clenched at his sides. For the first time in years, he didn't know how to respond. He should tell her to run, to disappear, to save herself from him. It would be the right thing to do, the smart thing. But as he stared at her, calm, unwavering, unafraid, he realized he couldn't. The thought of never seeing her again twisted something deep inside him, something he didn't have a name for. Instead, he exhaled sharply and met her gaze. "If you stay, you follow my rules." Madison didn't hesitate. "And if I stay, you listen when I pray." He let out a dry chuckle, the closest thing to amusement he'd felt in weeks. Deal. Neither of them realized how much that agreement would change them both. The penthouse shattered into chaos. Gunfire. The deafening crack of bullets ricocheting off walls, glass exploding into shards. Madison's scream sliced through the chaos, but Maxime had already moved. His instincts took over as he lunged toward her, shielding her with his body. His back pressed against the cold marble floor, Madison beneath him. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it began. Silence filled the room, except for the distant hum of sirens and Madison's sharp, panicked breaths. Maxime slowly lifted his head, scanning the damage. His men were already securing the area, shouting into radios. But none of it mattered, because in that moment, as Madison trembled against him, he realized the truth. His world had officially dragged her in, and he had no idea how to get her out. Hours later, Maxim sat in his office, gripping the edge of his desk so hard it creaked beneath his fingers. He was unraveling. He had spent years perfecting control, mastering fear, becoming untouchable. And yet tonight he had almost lost her. The thought made something sharp twist in his chest. "You could have died," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Madison stood in the doorway, silent for a long moment before she stepped inside. "But I didn't." He looked up. Her eyes were steady, warm. No fear, no accusations, just understanding. His hands loosened, his defenses crumbling, and before he could stop himself, he reached for her. Madison didn't pull away. She stood there, her breath mingling with his, her presence steadying the chaos inside him. Maxime's hand found her waist. It wasn't forceful or possessive, just there, holding her, grounding him. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to close the distance, to finally taste the softness of her lips, to lose himself in something, someone, pure. But then, in the quiet, she whispered, "You're worth saving." And just like that, the moment shattered. Maxime pulled back as if burned. His heart pounded against his ribs, but not from desire, from fear. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of being saved. Maxime made his decision. "We're leaving Moscow." Madison frowned. "Where?" His jaw tightened. "Somewhere safe." She searched his face, as if measuring his resolve. Finally she nodded, but deep inside, Maxime knew one thing for certain. He would burn the world down before he let anyone hurt her. The moment they were about to leave, his phone buzzed. Another message. "Run all you want, she will never be safe." Maxime's grip tightened around the device until the screen cracked. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was war, and he would end it. That night, Maxime sat alone in the dark. His mind was a battlefield. Every instinct told him to fight, to plan, to strike first. But for the first time, he felt powerless. His fingers tightened, then loosened. His breath came slow, uneven. And then, in the quiet, barely audible, he whispered, "God, if you're real, prove it." The words hung in the air. He didn't know what he expected, but for the first time in years, he felt something. Not power, not control, something deeper, something terrifying. Hope. Morning light filtered into the room, casting soft golden hues over the walls. Madison stirred, blinking awake, only to see Maxime standing at the window, his broad shoulders rigid, his gaze distant. Something was different. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. Then his voice, low but steady, "Teach me how to pray." Madison's breath caught. Maxim Mikhailov, the man who ruled with an iron fist, who had spent his life in the shadows, was finally breaking. But would he surrender before it was too late? Mikhail stood in the cold alleyway, behind an abandoned warehouse, his breath visible in the frigid Moscow air. His phone buzzed in his hand, and he hesitated before answering. His fingers trembled slightly as he swiped the screen. "It's done," he muttered under his breath. A low chuckle came from the other end. "Good, then the bratva will fall by its own hand." Mikhail clenched his jaw. He had been loyal to Maxime for years, but fear was a powerful motivator. He had seen what happened to those who stood in the way of the new power rising in Moscow. Maxime was a relic of the past, and if Mikhail wanted to survive, he had to choose the winning side. Turning off his phone, he took one last deep breath before disappearing into the night. The estate was eerily quiet that evening. Madison sat curled up on the grand leather couch, her Bible open in her lap. She read, but her mind wandered. There was something unsettling in the air, something she couldn't quite name. Maxime sat across the room, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His expression was unreadable, but she had learned to recognize the shadows in his eyes. "You ever think about walking away from all this?" she asked softly. His grip on the glass tightened. "There's no walking away from this life, Madison." She searched his face. "Are you sure about that?" Maxim let out a dry chuckle. "You don't understand, Angel. The moment you step into this world, it owns you." Madison frowned, but before she could respond, the lights flickered. A moment later, the entire estate plunged into darkness. Maxime was on his feet in an instant. The second, the lights flickered out. His instincts screamed danger. His hand moved on its own, reaching for the Glock tucked beneath his jacket. His body coiled like a predator ready to strike. Years of experience had honed his reflexes to razor-sharp precision. And right now, every fiber of his being was telling him, this was no accident. Madison's heartbeat thundered in her ears. The darkness stretched around them, pressing in like a living thing. Her breath hitched as she fumbled for something, anything, to ground her. "Maxime! Stay behind me!" His voice was sharp, urgent, cutting through the silence like a blade. A moment of eerie stillness followed. Then, A whisper of movement. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, the sound deliberate, controlled. Maxim's security detail moved into position, their Russian murmurs low and precise. Something was wrong. Then, glass shattered. A violent crash erupted through the estate as the first window exploded inward, shards scattering like deadly confetti. Madison barely had time to process the sudden chaos before Maxim lunged, gripping her arm and pulling her to the floor. Then came the first shot. The first gunshot tore through the living room window, shattering it into 1,000 glistening shards. The echo of the gunfire was deafening, reverberating off the walls like a war drum. Madison barely had time to scream before Maxim tackled her, pressing her body beneath his, shielding her with his own. The weight of him was grounding, heavy, safe. Another shot rang out, then another, bullets embedding into the walls, the furniture, the marble flooring. The estate was under siege. Maxim moved with precision, pulling his weapon free, rolling them both behind the solid oak couch as more bullets rained down. His mind calculated the attack. 3, maybe 4 shooters. High-caliber rounds. A well-planned assault. And worst of all, an inside job. Because they had cut the power, they had known exactly where to strike. Maxim's jaw clenched. Betrayal burned like acid in his gut. But there was no time to dwell on it. His priority was Madison. The smell of gunpowder thickened the air, mixing with the faint, lingering scent of Madison's perfume. Maxim lifted his head just enough to scan the chaos. Smoke curled in the air from where bullets had struck and splintered wood, but through the destruction, he saw him. Mikhail? His right-hand man, his brother, his betrayer. For a split second, their eyes locked across the battlefield of destruction. Mikhail stood among the attackers, dressed in black, a rifle clutched in his hands. And then, Mikhail raised his gun. Maxim fired first. The bullet tore through the air, clipping Mikhail's shoulder. He staggered back, his expression twisting with pain and something deeper, something like regret. But Maxim couldn't afford to care. Not now. Not when Madison's life was on the line. The air reeked of gunpowder and blood. The walls were scarred with bullet holes, furniture reduced to splinters. Maxim moved like a predator, his shots precise, his instincts sharper than ever. He was a soldier, trained for moments like these. Each movement was calculated, each trigger pull deliberate. Mikhail dove behind a marble pillar, returning fire. "You should have stepped down when you had the chance," he shouted, his voice laced with something between anger and desperation. Maxim's grip on his gun tightened. "You should have remembered where your loyalty lies." They fired at the same time. A bullet grazed Maxim's arm, searing through flesh. He gritted his teeth against the pain, his focus unshaken. Mikhail was breathing hard, pressing a hand to his wounded shoulder. "You can't win this, Maxim." Maxim smirked, cold and unrelenting. "Then why are you bleeding?" And with that he fired again. Mikhail barely had time to move before the bullet struck him in the side. He collapsed with a grunt, clutching his wound. Maxim didn't hesitate. He turned his gun on the remaining attackers. It was kill or be killed. Madison clutched the Bible she had carried with her since childhood, her knuckles white as she pressed it against her chest. Her heart raced, the echoes of gunfire rattling through the broken estate. She'd never seen this kind of violence, never been caught in the middle of war. But she knew one thing: there was power in prayer. Her lips moved instinctively, the words trembling but determined. "God protect us." Another bullet ricocheted off the wall, sending plaster raining down. Madison's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she pressed on. And save Maxim's soul. Something in the atmosphere shifted. For a moment, it felt as though an unseen presence had entered the room, wrapping around her like armor. And Maxim, caught in the storm of his own violence, faltered for just a second. Madison's whispered plea reached Maxim's ears, but it only ignited something dark within him. A prayer for his soul. She didn't understand. He wasn't a man who could be saved. He was a killer, a king of a blood-stained empire. And if she wanted him to live, she needed to pray for his enemies to die. With that thought, his rage exploded. He moved like a beast unchained, taking down each attacker with brutal precision. Blood splattered across his face, but he didn't slow. He would slaughter every last one of them if it meant keeping Madison safe. Madison watched, horror flickering in her wide eyes. This was the man she had been praying for, and it terrified her. Then, as the last gunshot rang through the air, silence fell. The estate was ruined, bodies littering the floor, smoke curled from the shattered remains of a chandelier. And Maxim stood among the wreckage, breathing hard, his hands drenched in blood. Madison took a shaky step forward. Maxim. But before she could say anything else, something shifted. A weight pressed on her chest. Then, it happened! A weight pressed upon her chest, a strange, powerful heaviness. Her body trembled, not with fear, but with something unexplainable, something divine. Her lips parted, and before she even understood what was happening, the words poured out, words that were not her own. Maxim, your kingdom will fall. Your hands drip with blood, but the Lord calls you still. If you do not surrender, everything you love will be torn from you. The words rang through the ruined estate like a thunderous decree. The moment she spoke, the weight lifted. Madison's breath came in sharp gasps, her eyes wide, her body frozen. Maxim stared at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. He had faced death, betrayal, war, but nothing had ever shaken him like this. Madison's voice had carried something otherworldly, and it terrified him. His pulse pounded in his ears. The taste of gunpowder lingered on his tongue. His grip on his gun tightened, knuckles white. Madison still knelt on the floor, her face pale, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She had spoken with authority, power, a power that didn't belong to her. The realization sent a sharp jolt of unease through him. For the first time in years, fear slithered down his spine. Not of death, but of the unknown, and of the God who might actually be real. Maxim staggered back as if struck by an invisible force. His breath came in ragged gasps, chest rising and falling too fast. The gun felt foreign in his grip now, its cold steel suddenly heavier. His entire world had been shaped by power, by violence, by the simple rule of dominance. And yet, with a single sentence, Madison had unraveled something inside him. She sat on the floor, her hands still trembling, eyes locked on something unseen. It wasn't just the words she had spoken, it was the way she had spoken them. Without hesitation, without fear. She had carried an authority that didn't belong to her. No, that was wrong. It didn't belong to anyone on this earth. A slow chill slithered down his spine. He had faced death, betrayal, and war. But this was different. Madison, he breathed, his voice hoarse, raw. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. The glow of the emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across her face. The woman before him was not the same one who had walked into his life a few weeks earlier. Something had shifted. Maxim, she said softly. Her voice was gentle now, but no less powerful. You heard it, didn't you? His jaw clenched. Of course, he had heard it, he had felt it. His kingdom will fall. The words scraped against the walls of his mind, refusing to leave. Tell me this is some kind of trick, he said, voice rough, uneven. Tell me you... But he stopped himself, because deep down, he already knew the truth. Madison had no reason to lie, no reason to put herself in danger like this. This was real, and for the first time in years, fear slithered through him. Not the kind of fear that came with facing a gun barrel or a blade in the dark. No, this was something deeper, more primal. It was the fear of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss he could no longer ignore. Maxim staggered back as if struck by an invisible force. His breath came in ragged gasps, chest rising and falling too fast. The gun felt foreign in his grip now, its cold steel suddenly heavier. His entire world had been shaped by power, by violence, by the simple rule of dominance. And yet with a single sentence, Madison had unraveled something inside him. She sat on the floor, her hands still trembling, eyes locked on something unseen. It wasn't just the words she had spoken. It was the way she had spoken them. without hesitation, without fear. She had carried an authority that didn't belong to her. No, that was wrong. It didn't belong to anyone on this earth. A slow chill slithered down his spine. He had faced death, betrayal, and war. But this was different. "Madison," he breathed, his voice hoarse, raw. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. The glow of the emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across her face. The woman before him was not the same one who had walked into his home earlier that night. Something had shifted. "Maxime," she said softly. Her voice was gentle now, but no less powerful. "You heard it, didn't you?" His jaw clenched. Of course, he had heard it. He had felt it. "His kingdom will fall." The words scraped against the walls of his mind, refusing to leave. "Tell me this is some kind of trick," he said, voice rough, uneven. "Tell me you—" But he stopped himself, because deep down, he already knew the truth. Madison had no reason to lie, no reason to put herself in danger like this. This was real, and for the first time in years, fear slithered through him. Not the kind of fear that came with facing a gun barrel or a blade in the dark. No, this was something deeper, more primal. It was the fear of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss he could no longer ignore. Maxime didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office, staring at the swirling amber liquid in his glass, the weight of Madison's words pressing down on him like chains. He had thought he had seen everything, that nothing could shake him, and yet the prophecy wouldn't leave him. It followed him through the ruined halls, through the blood-stained floor. It echoed in the silence. His kingdom will fall. Maxime downed the whiskey in one gulp, welcoming the burn, but even that couldn't drown out the voice in his head. He tried to rationalize it. A coincidence, a trick. Maybe Madison was just another person trying to manipulate him, to break him down. But no amount of logic could explain what he had felt. The presence, the weight of something unseen, something ancient, something more powerful than even the empire he had built. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had always believed that power was the only thing that mattered, that if he controlled everything, no one could control him. But tonight, he had lost control, and it terrified him. He poured another drink. Maybe if he drank enough, it would go away. Maybe if he drowned himself in the things that had always numbed him before, violence, alcohol, and power, it would silence the voice whispering in his ear. But deep down he already knew the truth. No amount of whiskey could drown this out. No amount of bloodshed could erase it. For the first time, Maxime felt something he hadn't felt in years, conviction, and it was suffocating him. Madison sat in the destroyed living room, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. Not for herself. For Maxime, the man who had built an empire on blood and fear, now stood on the brink of something far greater than he could comprehend. And he had no idea how to handle it. She had seen glimpses of his humanity before, hidden behind sharp words, cold glares, and an armor of cruelty. But tonight, that armor had cracked, just for a moment, just long enough for something divine to slip through, and it terrified him. Madison wiped at her tears, inhaling slowly. She wasn't crying because she was afraid. She wasn't crying because she regretted what she had said. She was crying because she knew the weight of what had been placed on Maxime's shoulders. She knew the agony of being confronted by the truth, of standing at the crossroads between who you were and who you could become. Maxime had spent his entire life running from the light. If he chose to stop now, if he chose to turn, it would cost him everything. Power, wealth, control. And yet, Madison knew the truth. What he stood to gain was so much greater. But would he see that? Would he even let himself consider it? She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warmth of the room. The air felt thick, heavy with something unseen. It wasn't fear. It was expectation. Madison knew that whatever happened next would define Maxime's future. He was either going to break completely or rise into something new. She prayed for the latter. She prayed with everything in her. But she also knew this was his battle, and he had to choose. Maxime was alone in his office. The walls, lined with shelves of expensive liquor and weapons, seemed to close in on him. The soft hum of the city outside was a stark contrast to the storm raging in his mind. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. Memories crashed over him like a relentless tide. The first man he had killed, the first betrayal, the empires he had built, the lives he had ruined. Each decision, each crime had felt necessary at the time. Power demanded sacrifice. That was the law of the world. But tonight, those choices didn't feel like victories. They felt like chains. Heavy, suffocating chains dragging him towards something he couldn't fight. And Madison's words, they echoed like a drumbeat of judgment. His kingdom will fall. He let out a harsh breath, pressing his hands against his temples. What did that even mean? Would he lose everything? Was there some unseen enemy plotting against him? Or was it something deeper, something more terrifying? Was it him? Had he built something that was always doomed to collapse? Maxime shook his head. He was being ridiculous. He was the most powerful man in the city. He had fought his way to the top, crushed anyone who stood in his way. And yet, that feeling wouldn't leave. That quiet, creeping certainty that no amount of power could protect him from this. He could kill men. He could silence enemies. But how do you fight against the voice of God? His breathing grew ragged. The whiskey bottle on his desk trembled as he reached for it. His hands weren't steady. That terrified him more than anything else. Maxime had never believed in ghosts. But as he sat in his dimly lit office, he swore he saw shadows moving, whispering. At first, he thought it was the alcohol, a trick of the dim lighting, his mind playing games with him. But no, it was real. He could feel it. Something was watching him. He stood slowly, his breath shallow. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally, flickering in ways they shouldn't. Then he heard it. A voice, faint, barely above a whisper, but unmistakable. His name, Maxime. His pulse thundered in his ears. His grip tightened around the edge of the desk. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice rough. Silence, but the air was thick, charged. His past, or something more? Maxime backed up toward the window, his heartbeat hammering. He had faced death more times than he could count, had put bullets through men's skulls without blinking. But this was different. This wasn't something he could fight with a gun or a knife. This was something far greater than him, something he wasn't prepared for. Part of Maxime wanted to ignore it, to drown it in blood and vodka, to keep moving forward, pretending nothing had changed. That was easier, that was safer. But another part, a small, desperate part, wanted to believe Madison's God could save him. The thought alone made him sick. How many times had he mocked men who clung to faith? How many times had he looked at religion as a crutch for the weak? And yet here he was, feeling weak, feeling small. For the first time, power didn't feel like enough. For the first time, he wanted something more. But could he really believe? Could a man like him even be saved? Maxime clenched his jaw, pushing himself away from the desk. No, this was madness. He was Maxim Mikhailov. He didn't break, he didn't beg. But then why did he feel like he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't escape? Like he had two choices, run or surrender. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know which one terrified him more. Maxime exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of his desk, as if the world itself was tilting beneath him. He had never been a man to hesitate. Every decision he had ever made had been swift, calculated, and absolute. And yet, here he was, paralyzed. Two choices lay before him. One, he could ignore everything, the visions, the whispers, Madison's words. He could drown them in alcohol, in violence, in the cold steel of his empire. He had spent years building walls around himself, ensuring that nothing, no weakness, no guilt, no regret, could touch him. Or he could face the truth. That was the terrifying part. Because if he acknowledged that Madison's God was real, if he dared to believe that there was something greater than himself, then what did that mean for everything he had done? What did it mean for the blood on his hands? The thought sent a wave of nausea rolling through him. Maxime had spent a lifetime justifying his actions. The world was brutal, and he had done what he had to do to survive. Mercy had no place in the kingdom he had built. And yet, Madison had looked at him with something he had never seen before. Not fear, not disgust, but sorrow. She had wept for him, not because of what he had done to her, but because she saw something in him that even he couldn't see. Hope. His chest tightened, and his hands curled into fists. He wanted to shove that thought away, to crush it beneath the weight of everything he had been. But he couldn't. Not anymore. The door creaked open. Maxim hadn't knocked, hadn't even known he was going to come here. And yet here he was. Madison stood in the dim light of the small room, her hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw him, but she didn't look surprised, almost as if she had been expecting this. Maxim's throat tightened. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was thick, filled with unspoken words, with a war he wasn't ready to name. Finally, he forced himself to speak. "Tell me about your God," he rasped. The words felt foreign on his tongue, as if he had spoken a language he had never known before. Madison inhaled sharply, her lips parting slightly. For a moment she just looked at him, as if searching his face for something. Then slowly she stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in," she whispered. Maxim hesitated. This was it. This was the moment that would either undo him or save him. Maybe both. With a slow breath he stepped inside and shut the door behind him. Madison's heart stopped. She had prayed for this moment, had begged God for it. And now Maxim was here, standing in front of her, looking like a man on the verge of breaking. She had seen him in many forms before, as the ruthless king of the underworld, as the cold, untouchable force no one dared to defy, as the man who had destroyed lives without blinking. But this was different. Maxim wasn't looking at her with arrogance. He wasn't sneering or mocking. He was desperate for something he didn't understand. Desperate for something he wasn't sure he was even allowed to have. Madison swallowed, stepping forward cautiously. "Why?" she asked softly. Maxim exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "I don't know," he admitted. He stopped, shaking his head. He looked like a man teetering on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Madison reached out, hesitating for only a moment before resting a hand on his arm. "God's been waiting for you, Maxim," she whispered. His whole body went still. The silence stretched between them, thick with something neither of them could name. Madison could see it, the war raging inside of him, the part of him that wanted to run, to fight, to deny. And the other part, the part that was finally starting to believe. But would he surrender before it was too late? Or would he walk away? Madison held her breath and waited. The storm had been brewing for months. Maxim just hadn't wanted to see it. Now, standing at the edge of the empire he had built with his own blood-stained hands, he knew there was no escaping what was coming. Everything was crumbling. His men were either dead, captured, or had turned against him. His enemies, once shadows in the dark, were now closing in, emboldened by his moment of weakness. Even the corrupt officials he had paid off were refusing to take his calls. He was alone, and he had never known such fear. Maxim paced the dimly lit apartment he had holed himself up in. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, suffocating him. His hands shook slightly, but he clenched them into fists, refusing to let his body betray him. He had survived worse, hadn't he? A gun sat on the table before him, the metallic glint catching the dim light. He had always known this life would end in one of two ways, by the bullet or behind bars. And yet, for the first time, he found himself wondering, was there another way? A knock at the door shattered his thoughts. His instincts screamed at him to reach for the gun, but something in him hesitated. Instead, he moved toward the door cautiously, pressing his ear against it. "Maxim," Madison's voice. His breath caught. He swung the door open without thinking, and there she was. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something between urgency and sorrow. "You shouldn't be here," he said hoarsely. "I had to come." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "Maxim, you have to leave this life behind, now." He scoffed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple." "It is," she countered. "You just don't want to see it. Maxime let out a hollow laugh. You think I can just walk away, that the people I've wronged will let me live? He shook his head. There's no escaping this. I've done too much. His voice broke and he looked away, ashamed of the weakness creeping into it. Madison stepped closer. Maxime, this isn't just about escaping them. It's about escaping yourself, the man you've become, the man you think you have to be. His jaw clenched. And what if that's all I know? Then let it die, she whispered. Her words sliced through him. He looked at her, and for the first time in years, he felt exposed, seen. What do you want from me, Madison? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I want you to choose. He frowned. I can't stay, Maxime. Not like this, she said, and there was a tremor in her voice. I love you. His breath hitched. She had never said those words before. But I will not stand by and watch you destroy yourself. I will not watch you run from the only one who can save you. Maxime swallowed hard. This is your choice, Maxime. Him or this life. His chest ached, as if something deep inside of him was being torn apart. Madison reached out, her fingers brushing against his cheek. I pray you choose right, she whispered. And then, just like that, she turned and walked out the door. Maxime stood frozen, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. She was leaving, and if he didn't do something, if he didn't make a choice now, he would lose her forever. The abandoned church stood on the outskirts of town, shrouded in darkness. Maxime had never been here before, and yet his feet had carried him straight to it, as if something unseen had been guiding him. The heavy doors groaned as he pushed them open. The air inside was thick with dust and silence. Stained glass windows, cracked and faded with time, cast eerie patterns of moonlight onto the wooden pews. Maxime walked forward slowly, his footsteps echoing through the hollow space. His throat was dry, his mind racing. He didn't know why he was here, only that he had to be here. He sank to his knees at the altar. For a long time, he just sat there staring at the ground, his hands clenched into fists. And then, for the first time in his life, he prayed. He didn't know the words, didn't know how this was supposed to go. So he just spoke. Raw, broken. If you're real, he whispered, his voice shaking, if you can even hear me, then show me. The silence that followed was deafening. And then, a presence, a warmth that wrapped around him, unlike anything he had ever known. And in that moment, Maxime saw a vision of Jesus. The man he had spent his life denying. The man Madison had spoken about with such conviction. And he was standing there, looking right at him. Maxime felt something inside him shatter. Tears, hot and relentless, poured down his face. He couldn't stop them. He didn't want to. He had killed, lied, betrayed. And yet, Jesus was looking at him with love, as if he had been waiting for him all along. Maxime bowed his head, his body racked with sobs. I surrender, he choked out. I can't do this anymore. I can't. His voice broke. I give up. And for the first time in his life, Maxime felt free. The city lights burned bright against the midnight sky as Maxime stepped out of the church. Something had changed. He could feel it in his bones. He was no longer the man who had walked into that church. He had been reborn, but the world didn't know that yet. And he knew his past wouldn't just let him go. As he approached his penthouse, the weight of reality settled over him. Would they believe him? Would she believe him? Maxime took a deep breath, stepping inside. The moment he did, he knew something was wrong. A presence in the shadows. And then a gun clicked. Maxime froze. From the darkness, a familiar voice spoke. You really thought you could walk away from this, Maxime? The past had come for him, and this time there was no running. Maxime stood at the threshold of his home, his body trembling from exhaustion, his mind still reeling from what had happened in the abandoned church. The man who had walked into that place was dead. The man standing here now was someone else. He reached for the door handle, but his hand hesitated. What if they didn't believe him? What if Madison looked into his eyes and still saw a killer? His past clung to him like smoke from a fire, but something inside whispered, "It is finished." He inhaled deeply and stepped inside. Madison was in the living room, standing by the window. The moment she turned and saw him, her breath hitched. Something had changed. He wasn't the same Maxim who had left. She took a cautious step forward. Maxim, his throat was tight. The words he had never thought he would say burned on his tongue. "I believe." Madison gasped, her hands covering her mouth. For the first time in his life, Maxim Mikhailov, the cold-blooded Mafia king, was free. But could a man like him truly leave his past behind? Maxim barely had time to adjust to his newfound faith before the storm came. His enemies had sensed weakness. The Mikhailov Empire was crumbling, and those who had once feared him now saw an opportunity to strike. At midnight, his home was surrounded. Armed men, faces hidden behind masks, waited for his blood to stain the earth. In the past, Maxim would have met them with bullets and steel. He would have relished the fight. But the man standing in his place now was no longer the warlord they had known. He didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he stepped onto the front porch, his hands raised, not in surrender but in peace. "I won't fight you." His voice carried through the cold night air. "Not anymore." His enemies hesitated. This was not the Maxim they had come to kill. One man, a longtime rival, stepped forward, gun in hand. "You expect us to believe that? A man like you doesn't change." Maxim exhaled. "I would have said the same thing yesterday." The man's grip on the gun tightened. "If you won't fight, then you'll die." Madison, watching from the doorway, clutched the cross around her neck. God, intervene. A miracle. Then it happened. A gust of wind, sudden and unexplainable, swept through the yard. The men shivered, looking around uneasily. The night seemed darker, heavier. The air itself shifted, as if something unseen had descended upon them. Then, without warning, the leader dropped his gun. A second later, another man stepped back, then another. One by one, Maxim's enemies retreated, their faces pale, their hands trembling. Something had spooked them, something beyond human comprehension. Within moments, the yard was empty. No blood had been spilled. Maxim's breath came in short gasps. He had seen 100 battles, but nothing like this. Madison stepped forward. "You see now," she whispered. "God fights for his own." Maxim swallowed hard. He believed. The days that followed were unlike anything Maxim had ever known. For the first time he felt peace. Not the fragile peace bought with threats and bloodshed, but real peace, the kind that wrapped around his soul and whispered, "You are forgiven." Madison saw it too. She had loved Maxim in the only way she could, through prayer, through faith that he could change. Now she was watching that very miracle unfold before her eyes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maxim sat beside her on the porch. He had never been a man of many words, but tonight he needed to speak. "I don't deserve you," he admitted. Madison turned to him, her eyes gentle. "None of us deserve grace, Maxim, but God gives it anyway." He looked at her then, really looked at her. A thought bloomed in his chest, one he had never allowed himself to have before. Could he be worthy of love? Of her love? Madison smiled as if she could hear the unspoken question in his mind. And in that moment, Maxim knew his past was not his future. The next morning, Maxim gathered what remained of his empire. Some had already fled, others stayed, waiting to see what their leader would do next. What he said left them speechless. "It's over," he declared. "The Bratva Mafia is no more." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some scoffed, refusing to believe it. Others were stunned into silence. Maxim continued, his voice steady. "I spent my life building this empire, and all it brought me was death, no more. From this day forward, my wealth, my resources, they will be used for something greater." And he meant it. Within weeks, the blood money he had hoarded for years was funneled into new purposes. Homes for orphans, shelters for the poor. The streets that had once feared his name now whispered it with wonder. Could a man like Maxim Mikhailov truly change? Yes, because God had rewritten his story. Months later, in a quiet chapel, Maxim stood at the altar. He had never imagined himself here. But here he was, waiting for Madison. When the doors opened and she stepped inside, his breath caught. She was radiant, not just in the way her white dress flowed around her, but in the light that shone from within her. A light he had spent his whole life running from. Now he was running toward it, As she reached him, he took her hands in his. For the first time, he didn't feel like a man haunted by his past. He felt like a man made new. As they stood before the pastor, as Maxim spoke the vows he never thought he'd say, one verse echoed in his heart. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. 2 Corinthians 5:17. And Maxim Mikhailov, the once feared Mafia king, smiled, because his past was gone. His future had begun.